Welcome to the Early Career Professionals in Mapping webinar series. The American Geosciences Institute has partnered with the National Cooperative Geologic Mapping Program to highlight the work of early career geoscience professionals, especially as it relates to the use and production of geologic maps. Each webinar will begin with a presentation from an early career geoscience professional, followed by an interview. Today's presentation is from Sydney Lance, a soil scientist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. She will speak about her background, uses of web soil survey, and soil mapping techniques.
Hello everyone, my name is Sydney Lance and welcome to my presentation today. I'm a soil scientist in the MLRA, or Major Land Resource Area Soil Survey Office in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I work for a part of the Natural Resource Conservation Service. We're part of the Soil and Plant Science Division of the United States Department of Agriculture, and today we're going to be diving into soil mapping with the NRCS. Well, by the end of this presentation is that you have a clear understanding of what soil mapping is, the overall purpose of soil mapping, why do we do it, and just an understanding of the two different soil mapping techniques, that being conventional and digital soil mapping, or DSM, as you'll hear me and many others say in the future. I wanted to provide two specific examples in Michigan as well as New Hampshire, both of which I was able to participate in and now get to see the final product, which is really exciting. But first off, I wanted to explain a little bit about myself, my career and education journey before landing here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I attended the University of Wisconsin River Falls near the Twin Cities, where I obtained a bachelor's in crop and soil science with an emphasis in soil science. And during my sophomore and junior year summers, I obtained an internship with the NRCS, a part of the Pathways program, specifically the soil science pathways, and went to St. Johnsbury, Vermont, also a soil survey office, where we assisted in the initial mapping of the White Mountains National Forest, which we'll explain a little bit later. Upon graduating in December of 21, I was converted full-time to Grand Rapids, Michigan in late March, early April of 2022, and have been here just over 2 years. So this is represented by all of those brown pins in this map. All of the blue pins that you see, I have traveled since either my internship or moving and converting full-time here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, whether or not they've been regional details, trainings, or even an initial mapping detail out in Alaska. Before diving into soil mapping, we need to have a very brief understanding of what soil survey is, as I will mention it multiple times. So soil survey in its simplest form is a detailed soil report, and we can give these reports for a specific area. For example, on this image on the right are different counties in Michigan. So when they initially did mapping, they did these hard copy bound books of each county across the whole US. These books will help you characterize the soil, what about taxonomically, looking at specific soil data, organic matter, bulk density, etc. And finally, probably the most utilized portion of these soil surveys is predicting suitabilities, offering limitations, what about overall interpretations. Now all of this can be accessed through the web through Web Soil Survey, which I will show later in this presentation. Now on to what is soil mapping. So soil mapping is a multi-step process that our end goal will be the soil survey, such as that hardbound book, or on a digital format such as Web Soil Survey. So a soil map unit, before we proceed, is an individually delineated collection of soil bodies with the same symbol, and we spatially represent this on a map. That's our end goal. So an example could be 49C, that's the label we give to a soil map unit, such as Groton Sand's 6 to 18% slopes. Now we are going to create all these soil map units. We're going to delineate them on the landscape, classify them, and just overall group them to the best of our ability. Next, we're going to represent these spatially on a map and provide all of those specific interpretations, such as that soil survey book. As I said earlier, you're going to want to develop a relationship. You're going to want to develop the soil landscape relationship. You want to figure out where soils are going to occur on the landscape. And a great way to figure this out is to utilize your landforms, landscapes. What about your geomorphic position, hill slope position, your vegetation and plant communities. All of this ties into each other. Everything is related and interconnected. You're going to use all of those methods to help develop a hypothesis and predictive model. You're going to develop this conceptually in your head as you head out into the field to verify. Now, as that said, it's utilizing the scientific method. Develop questions, generate your hypotheses, test them, go out into the field. You want to confirm them, deny them, see, oh, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I should dig a hole here to see if I do indeed see this soil or if it was different. And a great way when you come back in the field is to create something such as this, which we call a block diagram. It's looking at that soil landscape model that you maybe had in your head and visually writing it out, visually drawing it. In this case, we can see the Pipestone, Granby, Chelsea. You see Chelsea typically occurs in the more upland areas. Pipestone are on more level plains in between, where Granby is the more poorly drained soils. This also gives you an idea of the specific parent materials on the side cuts. You can see sandy outwash and maybe in certain areas loamy till. This is a great visual representation of building that conceptually in your head and then seeing it firsthand to see if what you did is correct. Another key part of soil mapping is the data collection point, going out into the field, verifying that conceptual model in your head. You're going to want to dig in a soil observation hole. You're going to want to look at the soil horizons and specific characterizations, such as texture, color, structure, rock fragments, effervescence, pH, roots, pores, and so much more. All of this plays a huge count into picking and selecting a specific soil series or a drainage class, etc., that will help you make a soil map unit later in the office. You can also look at landform and landscapes, depending on if you're in a glaciated area and you're on moraines, drumlins, eskers. These can be influenced, and you can be like, oh, I'm on a parent material of glacial till. You also look at geology, bedrock outcrops, etc. What about your plant communities as well? Yet again, this is all tied together and will help you develop that conceptual model in your head and ultimately figure out soil map units in the office. A great acronym to think of is CLORPT, C-L-O-R-P-T, climate, organisms, relief, parent material, and time. Everything, as we said over and over again, is interconnected, and it's great to see the repetition and patterns formulating as you're out in the field. The goal of soil mapping is creating these soil map units. This interface that you see here is called Soil Web. It's easy to navigate to specific areas within the US and see what's already been mapped there. This is an example within Michigan, and as you see these polygons on this landscape in yellow, these are all the different soil map units. I specifically chose 49C in this example to look at. 49C is the symbol given to this map unit. Now remember, soil map units are individually delineated soil bodies, meaning there are more than one soil found in that area of 49C. So in this instance, Groton is the most dominant frequent soil in that area, hence why in the name it's Groton sand 6 to 18% slopes in said given symbol. Now within this area, although Groton was most dominant, we did come across other soils or other soil series, and in this instance they came across Sphinx and Pipestone. They saw Sphinx a little bit more than Pipestone, 3% rather 2%, and overall 100%, including the 95% of Groton. This also gives you a brief idea of where they occur on the different landscapes and landforms. This is the ultimate end goal of soil mapping, is identifying the most dominant, most frequent soil, naming it, providing a symbol, and delineating it spatially on an area of interest such as this. Why do we map soils? Why should you care what's underneath your feet? Well, that's a great question. Soils are incredibly important, especially as they vary so greatly across the world. Mapping soils, they provide landowners with various capabilities to develop purposeful, suitable land use and management plans for all means. As I said, this can be anything from farms, ranches, mining reclamation projects, forest management, engineering projects, and much more. I wanted to provide a specific example here from a friend who's over in North Dakota, specifically Fargo. This is looking at the North Dakota State University in 2009. This image on the left, that is one of the dormitory halls, and there was a collapsed foundation which resulted in all the following floors falling in on itself, as you can see in said image. For those of you that do not know, Fargo or North Dakota is known for very heavy clay-rich soils due to an old lacustrine and glacial lake that used to be situated there many, many years ago, hence why it is very flat there. Now, these clays have a very strong shrink swell potential, that expand and contraction of the soil when it gets dry and wet over and over again. In this instance, in this dormitory hall, resulted in the foundation collapsing and the building looking as it is. Now, this image on the right that you see here is an example of web soil survey platforms, specifically looking at interpretations, the suitability, and limitations. This is an area of interest on the Dakota State University, and it's looking at the specific dormitory hall located in this red section. This is looking at dwellings with basements. Based off of the soil map units that were delineated, we do not recommend in this instance that you build dwellings with basements. Red is very limited. You are looking for green in this instance, and Fargo, North Dakota does not have that. Hence the importance of looking at your soils before you develop land use plans, no matter if you're in an urban setting or rural, is very highly encouraged. Another important aspect of soil mapping to understand is the overall order. So soil mapping can occur at very intensive scales as well as more relaxed scales are very extensive. Now, these range from order 1, which is very intensive, to order 5, which is very extensive. Now, this depends solely on the land use decisions needed for specific user needs. Now, what I mean by that is if you have an urban setting with a lot of buildings being constructed, or you have really intensive agriculture areas, you're going to want a higher soil order mapping scale to provide these landowners with efficient data. And that would be at order 1 or order 2 mapping. Now, on the flip side, in more parks, national parks, BLM land, public land, really remote areas that have very little land users, you don't need as intensive mapping. And that can be at an order 4 or 5. Now, these also have corresponding and different field procedures and delineations that we will follow protocol based in that soil survey manual, depending on which the landowners need. You have to understand the two overarching different techniques for soil mapping, one being conventional soil mapping and 2 being digital soil mapping, or DSM. Conventional soil mapping is way more conceptual. The soil scientist is building this in their head. They're going out in the field, collecting observation points, getting those GPS locations, coming back into the office, and using some remote sensing strategies such as digital elevation models, etc., to help create these polygons and ask yourself, where is the boundary between these two soils? This transitional zone, this marginal zone, where would I place that boundary? And you're creating that polygon, creating the vector data of that soil map unit. Now, digital soil mapping on the flip side is more well-driven, well-conceptually driven. You're using geospatial techniques to generate a predictive model of soil classes and properties in a geographic database. This is a quantitative model to help predict these different soil classes and properties in a GIS manner. This is all raster based. The 2 blocks on the right give you an idea of the difference between conventional and DSM mapping, one being way more transitional zone. You're trying to figure out where you would place that boundary in a vector sense, And DSM is using raster and assigning values to each individual cell. To list more elaborate information in regards to conventional soil mapping, as I said, you are looking at these transitional zones. You're trying to decide where the difference is between these two different soil entities and where you would delineate that difference. In a lot of instances, you're going to have to traverse and transect the landscape very purposefully. You have to place and know where you're going to dig holes to verify or deny this conceptual model that you're developing in your head. Remember, this is all polygon-driven, line-based, vector-based. This image on the right is to try to get you to think about this. Like if you were dropped off where that star is, down at the bottom of that slope, and you're ending where I'm currently sitting. This is up in Alaska, and this was a helicopter hitch. We were dropped off at that star, and this is our last hole that we're digging before we're hiking up about 100 more feet to where the helicopter is going to pick us up. If you were dropped off at that star, where would you walk? Where would you take a soil and vegetation observation to better understand the soil landscape relation, to start building that model in your head? Where do you think you would build it? Would you do it on the lower end of the slope, the foot slope, in the more wetter areas where those spruce trees are growing? Next, would you move upslope and start getting into the shrubbies, and then move on to the alpine environment? You just need to take into account slope, aspect, vegetation. And here's an image to hopefully get you thinking about building this soil landscape model in your head. Now on the flip side, digital soil mapping is way more well-defined. It is a well-defined central concept that expresses this variation across the landscape. As I said earlier, like soil is a natural occurring entity, and it can be rather difficult to consistently map. And for this, DSM is a great way to quantify this certainty and error. It uses training data and covariates, which I will explain a little bit later, together to create a predictive model to express this variation. All of the sampling is random, it's not targeted like in conventional. All of this is statistically sound, and it is raster-based rather than vector-based. We're going to dive into the two different examples found in the Northeast region. We're going to look at a conventional mapping example that I worked on along with my colleagues here in the Grand Rapids and Flint MLRA Soil Survey Office up in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan, as well as doing the initial mapping of the White Mountains National Forest during my internship years, which they are still working on today, over in New Hampshire and Maine. Here in Michigan, the entire state has already undergone initial soil mapping. So everywhere, every county has initial soil mapping lines, other than a few instances which we call these denied access. In these instances, landowners initially denied USDA employees onto their land to classify and map soils. And in this instance, either a change in landowner or the landowner now desires a forestry plan from the NRCS, which these employees need soils information to create, then the state soil scientists will reach out to us to go map this property. So this example is in Roscommon County, Michigan. It's a very small acreage, 640 in comparison to some of the initial mapping, but a fabulous way for new employees to learn and start developing this conceptual model in our head. And because this is landowner specific, we are mapping it at a second order. Before even stepping out on the property, we're going to have to do a lot of work beforehand to make sure we have a basic understanding of what we may encounter out in the field. First up is creating a pre-map of soil lines. So using a bunch of GIS methods, we're going to try to create this soil landscape relation and model in our head before entering into the field. We're going to use plant communities, geology, hill slopes, topographic images, and more to try to create an estimate where we think these different soil entities will occur on the landscape. Later, we will go out in the field with soil observations and verify these in the field. So these three different images showcase what we ultimately decided as our pre-map of the soil lines across a topo quad, a wetness index, as well as slope and hillshade. So we tried to section out all of the wetter areas from the high sloped areas to more upland areas, etc. Did our best with the GIS data that we had. Next, before we hit the ground running in the field to verify this conceptual model, we're going to want to look at the different soil series and soil map units bordering the denied access area in Roscommon County. We are very fortunate here in Michigan to already have all the counties initially mapped, so we can utilize the soil map units already found in these areas in this denied access acreage. We also do this because we want this area to be cohesive with the rest of the county and not have any anomalies at all. So while looking at this Roscommon County legend and specific series bordering the denied access area, these are all the series that we found. We're going to organize them by drainage class as well as particle size class, because those are two defining characteristics to help us choose a series out in the field. Particle size classes can vary, as you can see, from organic all the way to sandy, very differing and contrasting. Very poorly drained, as you can imagine, is wet. I will show you a picture in a bit. And excessively drained is going to be on those upland areas. Very sandy in texture and much quicker and faster to dig through. At last, we get to hit the field running. We get to go out and work together as a team day one, and then we'll split up and conquer the rest of the acreage in groups in order to collect all these soil observations as well as plant observations to develop and finalize the soil landscape model in our head before we recreate and delineate all these soil map units. Now, because this is more of a quick and fast way, we want to not do really elaborate soil observations, just enough to help us classify to those series based off of drainage class and particle size class. Down in this bottom right is an image of a colleague's mine soil observation. You can see he included horizonation, depth, color, texture, rock fragment content, redox depletions, which help indicate where the water table is, and ultimately drainage class. And he ultimately decided this was moderately well, and he labeled it as a Nestor soil series. Now, as I said, this middle image, you can see that is a very poorly drained and mucky soil, and we get very contrasting by such as what we would call a spot of salt up on a more upland area. Now, back in the office, it is time to look at all of our soil observations and assign the soil series to them. Then we're going to analyze our pre-map of the soil lines with our soil observations and see if any adjustments need to occur. Now, all these red dots that you see, yes, are all of our observations, but they are not all soil observations. Some of them might just be, oh, this area is wet, or this area is like my previous point labeled as 5, this is the edge of the wetland, etc. On the left block, you can see we slowly started to identify all the different series we were seeing, such as Croswell, Nestor, Sims, etc. So utilizing this new information that we got in the field, we can now adjust the model that we developed before using only GIS methods, and we can adjust that to get our final result. You can see here, this is our final result for the denied access parcel of land that we worked on utilizing the Roscommon County map units surrounding the property. And in order to share and see how we did both before and after, here is our pre-map before we went in the field and after. In general, we did a decent job showing the difference and capturing the difference in the soils across the landscape. However, there were different upland and wetland areas that we did not see coming, or there was a large mosaic of those occurring on the landscape, and we found a better way to represent that while in the field. Talk about the DSM version of soil mapping in the White Mountains National Forest. So this is part of the initiative of Soils 2026, which is basically we want to map all of the soils in the U.S. by 2026, including all public lands such as this national forest, much higher acreage as you can see, and we're going to map it in a second to third degree soil mapping due to proximity to civilization and towns. The first step in creating a DSM model is looking at environmental covariates. Covariates are measurable independent variables, and in this case, they are statistically related to a dependent variable. This image on the right gives you some basic ideas of what these covariates may be. You're going to want to think of CLORPT, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, or as well as SCORPAN, SCORPAN, soil, climate, organism, relief, parent material age, and spatial position / extent. All of these can be used in conjunction with each other to make and help predict for this model in the future. And you're also going to want to look at different input data. You're going to want to look at existing soil maps. What about point observations that were collected in the past? Can we use these now in other remotely sensed spectral data? Using those covariates and various input data and predictors that we're going to be using for this DSM model, you're going to want to create certain terrain or other spectral data, such as a digital elevation model, such as this image on the right. And based off of all these predictors, we're going to want to create a training observation set, verification set in the field to go verify what we see. So in this instance, the White Mountains National Forest, they decided to look at parent materials specifically, so such as the different tills, outwash, alluvium, colluvium, bedrock control, etc. Now in this instance, we used CLHS, conditioned Latin hypercube sampling. This is completely random sampling across different environmental variables, such as parent material. You can also look at slope, as well as drainage class. And this is much favored above all else because it is randomly selected. I wanted to also provide some other sampling observations that you may use, such as simple, random, stratified random, etc. But in our case, most common is CLHS. All right, field work. So all of these points are randomly selected based off of parent material in the White Mountains National Forest. This may mean you only have to bushwhack a half mile, or it might mean you have to hike 12 miles total on trail to even get to some of these points. They are beautiful and amazing, and for this reason, because some of them take so long to get to, we decide to do a little bit more of a soils collection and soil observations, as you can see by what I included on this slide, and it can take you to all terrains from alpine environments, spruce heavy, hardwoods. You may end up crossing a stream. All in all, it is very fun and enjoyable to see this landscape model come together in your head. So now, similar to conventional mapping, you're going to come back and you're going to assign soil series to all these soil observations. We're going to input these back into the predictive model to come back with an accuracy. We want it at least 60% accurate. Now remember, soils are a natural occurring entity and can be rather hard to consistently map. And we can use all these soil observations in series to identify our parent material, which in turn is what we were looking for initially as we were looking at parent material. Now you're also going to assign class breaks to all these based off of parent material, which will ultimately be assigned colors to visually represent on the model, which I will show you in a second. You can see here, this is our beautiful final product showcasing the different parent material breaks and 2 drainage classes with those class breaks we were mentioning earlier, utilizing the different soil observations, covariate, and GIS layers created initially. These class breaks can be broken down even farther here, as I can show you what these colors indicate. So if we work our way from top to bottom, on the summits and shoulders, this is all bedrock control, well-drained soils. These are represented by this pink as well as gray color. Next, we're going to migrate downslope into the side slopes and back slopes. This is all our different kinds of till, lodgement, ablation till. This is the orange, greens, and purples in the map. And then we finally make it into our valleys and floodplains. This is glacial outwash and alluvium, which is your light blues and dark blues. And again, these are all the class breaks assigned from the soil observations, from the covariates, and GIS data, all coming together to create this predictive model, 60% accuracy or greater. And they are currently working on creating a higher accuracy map for the future. All in all, now I hope you're able to have a little bit of understanding of what soil mapping is and the soil survey, why we should do it, why you should take concern and look at the soil map beneath your feet using Web Soil Survey. You can also understand a little bit behind the conventional and the DSM tactic and strategy for soil mapping and apply them to real life examples in Michigan and New Hampshire. To reach out with any questions you may have at my email here, sydney.lance@usda.gov. Happy to help in any way that I can. Be sure to connect with us in the future at any of these above links, and I look forward to talking with you in the future.
Sydney, thank you so much for sharing some of the work that you do related to soils. Lindsay and I are excited to dive into some of the details of your work and hear about your experiences leading to this stage of your career. And just a reminder for the audience, if you are tuning in during the premiere, Sydney is available to answer questions in the chat. First off, Sydney, I'd like to ask, what do you believe have been some of your key moments, experiences, and so on that have led you to be where you are now?
Where I am now, I would say for sure the number one was when I went on a big college tour with my family to figure out where I was going to attend. And when I went to the University of Wisconsin River Falls, where I currently where I did attend and ended up graduating, I met Holly Dolliver, a professor of soil science, and she just told me about all the opportunities there were at the university and beyond within soils. And I was like, I am sold. Like I was able to attend various conferences my time there. I was able to join the soil judging team. I was able to complete research with various faculty members as well as conduct my own while I was working in the soil laboratory. There were a lot of hands-on classes, but as I said earlier, above all else, the soil judging was definitely the key factor. She also was the one who encouraged me to pursue the internship that I did with the USDA NRCS. I ended up accepting the position over in St. Johnsbury, Vermont because of Holly Dolliver as well. So that was amazing. And I would say currently in my job now is just like building connections and talking with people. Like I attended our basic soil survey training, which is for all entry-level employees in the agency. And I just happened to introduce myself to the regional director of Alaska and had the opportunity to go up last summer for an 8-week detail. It's just crazy how little things lead to big things.
Great. And I also wonder, so you mentioned like the communication aspect and working with different people and the hands-on aspects. Are those some of your favorite parts of your job now, or are there other parts also that you kind of enjoy?
I love interacting with all people. I really enjoy the outreach portion of our job. We do a lot with a local university in Allendale, really close to where I live, Grand Valley. And we get to help with their soil judging team as well as do presentations with the intro level classes. And it's just fun interacting with college students and trying to help them figure out what life's all about. I also really enjoy that we get to be outside all the time and get to see some untouched parts of the US, which is really cool. And the last part that I really enjoy is the variety of work. There's way more projects that we do on all sides, whether or not it's just computer based, GIS based, or in the field. There's way more variety and just way more opportunities than I imagined.
Well, it sounds like you have great mentorships and ways to connect with, future students who kind of want to do the same work. So, what advice would you give someone looking for similar opportunities that you've had, like your internships and other experiences?
Great way to go is to start talking with all of your faculty just for a good beginner entry level, as well as other students like juniors and seniors within your local university to figure out what kind of internships and opportunities they did. But I think the number one that a lot of people encouraged me to do was to set up informational interviews, both within academia world, doing private sectors, as well as within the governmental agency. Luckily, I had that pretty easily through my internship. I was able to interact with people within the agency, but through them, I was able to talk with people in the private sector. So just reach out and see if they're willing to sit down 15, 30 minutes and just ask them all the questions just to see if, oh, I think I could like this, or oh, I don't know about this. I think that was a big advice that I would give to anyone.
Awesome. And other advice, I didn't know if for your educational background, is that kind of typically required for your position? Did you receive a lot of training from your mentors and other people, or from those informational interviews? Did you receive some information about which programs you needed to do, or kind of the preparation for the job?
Yeah, that's a good question to think about. I'd say for my career, you definitely need a bachelor's in order to pursue the soil scientist within USDA NRCS. And you do need, for the soil science position, a minimum of 15 soil credits. So they can be anything from the intro to soils, soil fertility, soil chemistry, anything with soils in the name, as well as like geomorphology and some geology related courses as well. Now, in terms of talking to other individuals within our agency as well as private sectors, I think GIS is like a huge forefront of the future, and just learning how to use it, I think in college would have been very beneficial. I didn't have that availability when I was in college, and I wish I got a minor at that time, but I would encourage people definitely to pursue GIS in R and all of those various platforms to kind of set you ahead.
Great. And in addition to GIS, you talked about in your presentation using the landscape and geomorphology to predict like types of soils that you'd find in an area. So could you tell us more about that process and maybe some unique soil characteristics you've encountered as you've done that work?
For sure. So I think in the presentation I showed a block diagram, and that's a good just visual basic representation of where you might see specific soil series. That block diagram I showed was pipestone. So let's just think about pipestone for a second. If you can visualize, we'll show a picture of that block diagram as well. Pipestone, on that block diagram, you can assume certain things. So on the sides of the block diagram, it'll say the parent material. And then in that instance, you can see, oh, it looks like sandy outwash is going to be the entire profile face for pipestone. So you can expect to see a very sandy textured, maybe some more rounded coarse fragments throughout that profile just by looking at that block diagram. You can also assume how the landscape looks where pipestone is. It's a pretty low sloping, flat, if you will, landscape. So you can say, oh, this is probably some form of plain. And since we know the parent material is outwash, glacial outwash, we can assume that this parent material would be in glacial outwash plain. So you can utilize that basic landscape model to try to grasp that idea in your head, just to give you a basic understanding of what I might expect if I were to go out on this certain landscape and hopefully see a pipestone. Hopefully that helps a little bit there. And some unique characteristics that we've seen in Michigan, I think one of my favorite ones I've never seen before, it's a lamellic material, which is a limnic material, and this limnic material is called marl. Marl is very white in color. You'll notice it. It's very obvious when you're digging in organic, and all of a sudden you see this really white colored. It has a bunch of seashells, really tiny seashells in it, and it also, if you were to drop hydrochloric acid on it, due to all of the carbonates, calcium carbonates found in the soil, it fizzes very violently. So that's probably one of my favorite soil observations, unique characteristics here in Michigan.
That sounds really cool. Any chance you know like what formed that?
For sure. Marl, any limnic material typically forms in water deposited situations. So this used to be a lake or used to be underwater at one point, flooded, and then all of a sudden that water disappeared, and that dry nature resulted in that accumulation of that white with all the sand and the calcium carbonates.
That's awesome. That definitely sounds striking when we are across the white color and able to use some hydrochloric acid. I know it's always so fun to see a result happening. So in addition to the observation of color, like you just mentioned, can you tell us more about the other observations you might make when looking at soils and soil horizons?
For sure. There's so many different observations and characteristics of soils that we use. I'd say the main ones, if we were to just grab a quick and dirty example, would be soil depths in terms of the horizon, soil texture, color, something we call redoxamorphic features. It's just how much the water fluctuates within the soil and creates either these red, really beautiful colors in the soil or these more blue grayish colors. And then we'll also look at fragments. And all of these different characteristics can help us within soil taxonomy and ultimately picking a series such as pipestone. But if we were going to go beyond that, there's so much more we can do. We use a form called a 232 form, and this is a front and back, very elaborate form, and we can do everything from write down all the horizons, depths, colors, textures. We can also do consistency, like how well an aggregate will break in between your fingers with a certain force, structure, how it falls, how it looks within the face, as well as it falls on your hand. We can also look at roots and pores. So there's many different aspects to look at that all in all play a huge role in soil health and ultimately soil mapping too.
So it sounds like
Um,
you're not really just like looking at the soil, but you're chipping off pieces, playing with it, doing sampling and kind of
Yes.
manipulating it as well.
Yes.
Awesome. And
It's
then you
fun.
did
You get your hands dirty.
which is, I know, one of the most fun parts about soil mapping and mappers in general, being able to get those samples. But when you were describing, you mentioned the water table and you kind of experience the water fluctuation, and it can be either red or blues or grays. What does that tell you about the water, if it is red or if it is the kind of the more blue and gray?
Usually the more blue and gray indicates a lack of oxygen. So in this case, either you'll have a water table just standing there for a very long period of time, and usually we'll see really heavy organic materials, muck as we call it. It's really wet and just feels kind of greasy and grimy. But then underneath we can have, like, let's say a clay rich soil, and it will be rather hard, but it'll be just this stunning blue color because of how long that water's been existing within that profile. Now on the flip side, all of this is pertaining to iron. So iron um, in areas that lack oxygen will turn more of a blue. In areas where it becomes oxidized, it'll turn that really pretty red color within the soil. And usually this will be in like root channels or old worm channels, etc.
Nice. I love the vocabulary that you have. Muck. I've never thought of that as a technical term, but that's awesome. But on the more technical side, you did talk about use of conventional versus digital soil mapping. So can you tell us more about when you would use one versus the other?
I would say, because we're in the forefront still of the digital soil mapping world, I think a lot of people still gravitate towards conventional because they know it. It's just that safety net. You're like, I'm not quite ready to move on and learn the new platforms of digital soil mapping. So I wouldn't say there's a case to case basis. I would say the only one that I can think of that you would use conventional rather than digital soil mapping is terms of acreage size. Like, for example, for one of our that I used in the presentation, the denied access. It was a rather small acreage of land, only 160 acres, and you wouldn't want to take that time to use the digital soil mapping rather than going out in the field. Another instance you may use conventional is you want those younger soil scientists to start to develop that in their head before resulting to a computer to do it. Another instance, I'd say just the pros for digital soil mapping is it's way more efficient, way more time effective. It's way more accurate, way more consistent than using just our brains out in the field.
And speaking of accuracy, how do you ensure the accuracy and reliability of the maps that you produce?
A lot of this will be, at least for digital soil mapping, we'll be using a lot of training data, going out into the field and verifying what the model predicted. Like if you was predicting a sandy outwash material in this certain area, you'll go out to that exact point and be like, yep, it is exactly what I saw or no. And then we'll plug that back into the digital soil mapping model to try to increase the accuracy. And our goal is to get it to be 60%. So if we're at 48, that means we need to do more training data and training points in order to reach that accuracy level of a minimum of 60. And because soil is such a unique landscape and really hard to grasp and try to create a model for. So we're trying to go towards a digital soil mapping model to try to increase that efficiency and accuracy, though it can be a challenge.
But is it, so it sounds like it is kind of going out in the field and verifying those points is the most useful way to do that
Correct.
accuracy. Okay.
Correct. Yes.
And another one of the challenges that you mentioned was you had that big heading saying like denied access. So why might someone deny a soil mapper access to their land?
I would say in most instances, number one reason I think a lot of people just don't want to have anything to do with the government. They don't want to be involved or be associated with us because they're not sure. I think a lot of people don't know who the Soil Survey Office is, and they're like, why is this really who you are? And I think in other instances, people are nervous we might find something out on their property that puts them out of regulation or compliance with some of the USDA programs, and they don't want that either.
Yeah, so do you guys do any outreach maybe to like let people know more about your organization?
We are starting to do more and more, and I think that's the number one. We definitely need to let people know we're here and we're here to help them and benefit them. We're doing more each county has a conservation district as well as area offices. So now we're reaching out and going to more of their workshops as well as going out in the field and talking to individuals. So yes, but we need to do more.
Yeah, because we definitely worked with teachers and students using the web soil survey, like you showed in your
Great.
presentation. And some of them have asked, "Oh, how do you know what's in my backyard?" And we're like, "Well, it'd be good for you
Yeah.
guys to do presentations like that so they can learn you don't have to actually map out every single literal point."
I would agree.
Yeah, it was very funny. Like Lindsay mentioned, one of the teachers was really up in arms. Who was in my backyard doing this? And I was like, no, no, no. They take, as you mentioned, they need some samples to verify, but it's not like they're in every person's backyard. And so speaking of getting into everyone's backyard, how do you handle the challenges of mapping soils in areas that are remote or difficult to access locations? I think you mentioned like the White Mountains of the National Forest.
Yeah, the White Mountains National Forest definitely had more challenges in terms of access than here in Michigan, just due to road access. Like, how are you going to get to some of the points that are up on a mountain face, etc.? So usually up there, it required a lot of hiking. Like I had some days where I think we would do 12 miles round trip, so like 6 miles on a trail to bushwhack to go to a point and come right back down. So if you enjoy being outside, that's fabulous. But we also, I think safety is the number one concern usually in those remote areas. And in order to just decrease any safety concerns that may happen, we always work in pairs. So you always have that safety net with one other person, and you always tell somebody where you're headed every day you're going out in the field. And we also use a spot tracker while we're out there too. And just another example, when we were in Alaska, those are very hard to get to as well. And we used a helicopter in those instances to get to different areas. You can use boats. Here in Michigan, luckily, everything's pretty accessed through forest roads or just paved roads as well.
Do you have to go through some sort of training to be able to go on all that equipment, like helicopters, boats, and all of that? What's the training like to be able to be allowed to use those pieces of equipment?
For Yes, for Alaska, we definitely had to go through a training. We had to do an online training prior to even stepping foot into Alaska, and then we also had to do some training in the field. We had to do a bear and shotgun training and actually get approved to carry a shotgun with us due to the amount of grizzly and black bears up there. And we also had to do what we called learn to return, or like a wilderness first aid course while we're up there as well, which I think is really huge for our job.
Did you have to use any of that training while you were out there, running into bears or having to use the first aid training?
Luckily, no one got injured during our time up there, which I'm very thankful for. We had one bear encounter on our first day in the field, which I was like, oh no, is this a sign? But luckily, we didn't have to administer bear spray or the gun or anything. It went away after a few times, and we managed to get away from the site.
And speaking of that, I'm guessing you guys do like leave no trace sort of training as well. So like, making sure that you keep the environment relatively intact, right?
Yes, yes. That would be, now you just got me thinking about another conventional versus digital mapping. Conventional mapping, because we're out on the field a lot, it's definitely more invasive and more intrusive than digital soil mapping. So we try our best, especially when we're on private land, to keep it as minimal as possible. Luckily in Michigan, we can dig a very small hole, like maybe down to a foot, and then we'll auger the rest of the way. So that really decreases the amount of space that we occupy for those pits. I like to use a tarp to toss all of the spoil pile on and throw it right back in the hopes that I was never here and you didn't see it. So
That's great. That's, yeah, a really great thing to consider.
mhm.
Another thing you talked about was the orders of mapping. So can you give us more detail on what this means and why there are different orders?
So the orders of mapping is a way in which to be more elaborate in terms of the soil mappiness that we provide the public, rather than doing all land the same level, or what we would call order one. Order one's the most elaborate and finite example of soil mapping, while order five is the more generic. So this is, you have to ask yourself, like, how is this land going to be used, or how is it currently used? Especially in terms of us humans. Are we in an urban setting where we're constantly building up new buildings, building bridges, roads, etc., or around like a Bureau of Land Management property or national park, where really it's just hiking trails, maybe a parking lot, etc. Like us humans aren't going out and altering the land. So in that case, you'll use order one mapping for those more elaborate, intensive land use management. So they must include like experimental plots, or if you need regulation and permits for such as a bridge or over water, different buildings, etc. Order two usually is where we would do the different agriculture as well as urban planning. And then three, four, and five 4 and 5 specifically for more of the national parks, Bureau of Land Management, more areas where people just, they don't live, it's more remote.
In your talk, in addition to orders, you mentioned kind of the sampling method, how random sampling of soil is preferred over other methods such as systematic. Why might this be, and when might others systems be chosen?
For sure, like in all, random sampling is so much better because you don't have any bias or preference when out sampling. And another instance, like we use the CLHS, it's the conditioned Latin hypercube sampling, and this one is a type of random sampling. The systematic and all those other examples on there, I should have prefaced, they all are some form of randomness in terms of sampling. Just the conditioned Latin cube hypercube method, sorry, the CLHS, that one's just more random in terms of looking at different covariates. Like this one is generic by a computer, and we're utilizing like 2 different covariates, and that example would be like parent material and drainage class. So we want to try to get on every single parent material and drainage class across an area of interest, so the computer can help us generate those. Why systematic, I would say, is more of a specific area in which you'll be in like the rightmost corner or this certain degree in a section grid pattern.
Great. How do you stay updated on developments in soil science? So, and like mapping techniques. So, are there any like journals or organizations or conferences that you might follow or attend?
For sure. There's way more than I there would be. Like there's a lot of focus teams within our divisions. I fall within the soil and plant science division, and all the different new projects, if you will, have focus teams. So such as digital soil mapping has a focus team that'll have a meeting about once a month, and they'll get some form of highly trained, someone that really knows what they're talking about to bring a different awareness about digital soil mapping and just to try to get feedback since it is such a new forefront. We also have others focus teams for urban mapping, coastal zone, as well as dynamic soil properties. So that's one way to definitely dive deeper into it. Another instance, at least for the agency, a lot of people work with the National Cooperative Soil Survey. So that's both private academia as well as the governmental side. They host conferences both regionally and nationally every other year. So that'd be a great one to get involved with. Also, the Soil Science Society of America. You become a member and attend conferences through them as well.
Great. And do you learn a lot about like techniques of how to map soils in other areas, or do you really kind of focus on like what's unique to your specific location?
Usually in those conferences, this is what we found in our office, pros and cons. We have questions. Can you help us answer them? And then people will come together and try to solve each other's issues that they're coming up in their office and then look at it at a broad scale to try to come up with the new standards and procedures to hopefully improve within all the offices.
And are collaborations like that pretty common where you're working kind of together to solve an issue or with academia and industry, or is it kind of siloed typically?
Personally, I think it's the intermingled. At least it depends greatly on the state. Like here in Michigan, luckily we have 2 different universities that we're working with pretty regularly and 2 professors in particular. So it's really nice to build that camaraderie and just to get that background from all the different people because they have different backgrounds than the PhDs rather than all of us soil scientists who work for the USDA. So luckily there is collaboration. I hope we build more and more in the future.
Yeah, and so for your collaborations, is it mostly collaborations on mapping, or are there other projects that you might want to, like, you're curious about soil and you have the opportunity to do research or collab? Maybe that's a collaboration in the future. You know, about some ideas or thoughts you have around that?
Yeah, we definitely, so mapping definitely is one of them. I would say lately, at least in Michigan, usually it's pertaining to other types of projects. Like we're hoping to bring coastal zone soil survey to the Great Lakes. So that's really exciting. And one of the professors has a decent background on that. So we're hoping to work with him to bring that to our agency. One of the university partners at Grand Valley State University works a lot with the wetland soils or those redoxomorphic features. So working with her and her students, because if she's finding plots, we should go out there with her or vice versa with us. So really it's a wide array, covers everything.
So staying on that topic of like current trends and advancements, like changes in soil mapping, are there any you find particularly interesting or relevant to your work?
There's so many, and that's what I love about this work. There's so many different avenues to dive down, and I feel like being early on, I'm trying to figure out those different avenues. I definitely want to learn more about digital soil mapping, specifically with utilizing the platform called R. I find it a bit of a behemoth, and I want to dive my way into it and learn it a little bit more. Personally, I find the dynamic soil property world really intriguing, and that's a new forefront for the future. It's looking at various properties that change within a human lifespan and looking at across different land use managements.
So in that program you mentioned R, is that the one that you have to learn coding for, correct? Yeah. Okay, so great. So people who are interested in computer science might find an avenue in soil science as well.
Definitely.
Cool.
It's definitely the forefront, and everyone's encouraging everyone to use R now.
Awesome. And Sydney, you kind of touched upon this a little bit, but we're going to wrap up the interview with our last question about what are some professional goals that you have in the future, and maybe where do you see yourself going from here?
Ooh. I think personally, at the current moment, I just want to learn as much as I can about all the different avenues within soil science because there's way more than I ever thought there was. And I want to be able to interact with all people across the country as well, specifically in this region, by going out and assisting on different projects. Like this year, I'm fortunate enough to be able to go learn about a soil carbon monitoring project down in West Virginia, and then I'll be going to help with urban mapping in Niagara Falls, and then I'll be helping with a dynamic soil property project in Connecticut. So I just want to keep building those connections and seeing, oh, this is what I like, this is not what I like, and figure it out. Because right now I'm content where I'm at, but maybe one day I could see myself as an office leader or maybe pursuing the international sides of things. We'll see. I'm just thankful for all the opportunities and all the people I've met so far.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I know that whenever I've talked to anyone doing mapping, but specifically soil mappers, it's the more soil you see, the better mapper and scientist you are. So yeah, just getting that variety of the different soils and areas definitely would be great to have under your belt.
Definitely.
Awesome. Well, Sydney, thank you so much for talking with me and Lindsay today and sharing your work with us. We've learned so much about soils, and we are excited to get to the Q&A in the chat. And if you have any other questions, feel free to email us, and looking forward to hearing the feedback about the talk. Thanks so much, Sydney.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for attending today's webinar. If you have any questions that were not addressed today, please email them to us at webinars@americangeosciences.org with the subject line EC Webinar Sydney Lance. Please join us for the next webinar in this series, which will feature Claire Benton from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, who will talk about her work classifying and mapping soils. To access the recording of this webinar, as well as the rest of the webinars in this series, please visit the Early Career Professionals in Mapping YouTube channel.